If you're trying to grow your business and your brand with targeted podcast interviews, one of the critical factors is finding the ideal podcasts. I almost think of it like going fishing. If you're fishing for sharks, you know they live in water. Well, fishing in the Great Lakes is not going to help you, and fishing in a swimming pool will not get you sharks. Today, we're going to go through the algorithm that Interview Valet is, the 4 things to look at in every podcast, not to only find out if it's a great podcast, but if it's a great podcast for you. And speaking of a great podcast, I'd like to introduce you to one right now.
Hello, this is Jamie J., host of Culture Eats Strategy Podcast, and you're listening to Podcast Guest Profits, hosted by Tom Schwab and sponsored by Interview Valet.
Hey, if you don't know Jamie, check out his podcast. I always joke around that Jamie is one of those people that could never get convicted in any county in the United States because you couldn't find 12 people that don't know him and love him. But hey, let's get back to picking the best podcasts. Today, there are over 1 million podcasts on iTunes. You don't have time to go on all of them. And the vast, vast majority of them won't do you any good. Here's the dirty little secret. While there's more than 1 million out there, less than 300,000 have gone live in the last 30 days. It's easy to start a podcast, hard to keep it going. So what do you look at? Now, over our experience over the last 6 years, on over 20,000 different podcast episodes with 500 guests, we've come together with an algorithm that looks at 4 things, and we'll dissect all 4 of these. The first one is the podcast. The second one is the website. The third one is the reach. And the fourth one is previous experience with guests. All of these are important, depending especially on your goals with this. So let's unpack them. The podcast. That's what everybody looks at first. Most people will say bigger is better. No, better is better. You know, there's more fish in the ocean than there are in a barrel of, but if you can find a barrel with your fish in it, man, that's the one to go to. So how do you judge a podcast? Well, first, remember I said most podcasts don't publish, and in the industry it's called pod fade. Most podcasts die within the first 10 episodes. So unless you're very confident in that this podcast is going to take off, or that they've already got a great following or great potential, you probably want to let them build an audience first. So look at the number of shows they've done. The other thing is to look at their consistency. Go back and, do they publish every week consistently? Or if they've got a podcast that publishes twice a week, do they do that consistently? When you start to see them miss episodes, that's a red flag that something is happening. And if you are a listener and they start missing episodes, you probably won't be a listener for long. The other thing to look at is, does the podcast speak to your ideal audience? Somebody came to us once as a client and said, I want to be on this great podcast because I want to talk to C-level executives of publicly traded companies. And I'm like, it's a great podcast, but do you really think that those listeners are listening to a podcast that starts out with yo, yo, yo? It's not for your listeners. Often you can tell a lot by a podcast by the host. Listeners will often be like the host or aspire to be like the host. Gives you a sense of their audience. Other things you can do is look at the different lists. There's Chartable, there's iTunes. See if they rank there. Now, granted, they only rank the top 100 or 200 podcasts. And like I said, bigger is not always better, but you can look at that. Ratings and reviews is another signal to look at. It used to be more important as everybody went to iTunes, and now that there's different players, just because they don't have a lot of ratings and reviews, and it's a new podcast, that's something to look at. So first thing we talked about was the podcast. Most people stop right there, but you need to go on to the second thing, which is the website. You see, the best podcasts are the ones that have show notes. And this is important because every time you're on a podcast, they're going to give a backlink from their site to your site. In digital marketing, this is called backlinking, search engine optimization. You heard it referred to as SEO. This is very important because it's really one website telling the search engines that, hey, we think that this is a great quality site and you should send traffic there. Those signals are what cause you to rank and go up in the organic search engine ranking. So when somebody puts in a keyword, you come up on page 1 instead of page 20. Very important. Early on, we had a client that came to us, a very, very bright guy, Q Harrison Terry. He now works for the Mark Cuban companies. But he used this as a strategy when he started out. Whenever he'd start a new company, he'd go out there and earn backlinks. In the past, people would buy backlinks and Google would come back and punish them for that. But to earn backlinks on podcast interviews is a very, very popular and powerful strategy. We talk with some clients and we'll say, would you rather be on Tim Ferriss's podcast, maybe get, $250,000 listen, a $250,000 listens, or would you rather go on a podcast that may be the Harvard Business undergraduate podcast with 250 listeners? And they're like, hold it. One comes with a harvard.edu backlink. Give me that one every time. If a podcast doesn't have show notes, if they're not linking back to you, you're not going to get this value. So definitely look at that. So we've talked about the podcast. We've talked about the website. The third one is the reach. Not everybody finds out about a podcast from listening to the podcast. So look at the show. Are they promoting it on social media? Sign up for their newsletter. Are they promoting it on their newsletter? Only 50% of the US population now listens to a podcast. But if people are promoting it on their social media or in their email list, you could still reach those people that never even listened to the podcast. They can find out about you. Also, all social media is not created equally. Look at the social media where your ideal audience is. So if you find that your ideal audience is on Instagram and you want to grow your Instagram following, well, we would start searching for podcasts that have a great podcast, have show notes, and have a strong Instagram following. If your audience is on LinkedIn, well, use that as the signal. If you think your audience looks more at email, well, then go ahead and sign up for their email list and see how they're promoting the podcast there. All of these things are important. The podcast, the website, and the reach. The final one, well, that's experience with previous clients. And for us, this whole algorithm, it's a little bit art, it's a little bit science, and it's a whole lot of experience. With that, we see what podcasts always convert so well and which ones don't. Now, one thing I would offer to you as something that we have found is those podcasts that have authentic conversations always do the best. They convert best, they engage best. Early on, podcasts would ask the same 5 or 6 questions to every guest. It was easy for the host, it was easy for the guest, but it got boring really quick. And it's really hard to explain your heart, your passion, your business, who you help, what your values are, if the questions you get are, what book is on your nightstand? So look at that. The ones that are more engaging will actually convert a whole lot better. So there you have it. As you go through the million podcasts and start looking which ones could be best for you, look at that. Look at the podcast itself. Look at the website. Look at the reach. And then finally say, is this the type of show that I could have an authentic conversation with and people could really get to know, like, and trust me? Hey, podcast guesting, podcast interview marketing is a great way to build your business and build your brand. It's like Rand Fishkin says, the best way to sell something today is not to sell anything, but to earn the respect, awareness, and trust of those who might buy. I believe in that. And I believe that if you get on the right podcast, start talking to those people who might buy, you're going to have great results too. So thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions that you would like answered, please put them in the comments below and we'll start answering those also. Thank you so much.